Grace to you and peace from God our Creator and Christ our Redeemer. The introduction of John the Baptist is a remarkably political one. Contrary to our modern sensibilities about religion staying clear of the realm of politics, Luke grounds John's ministry in the midst of a political reality, locating him among no fewer than 7 rulers and religious leaders. Why? Well, partly to set up the contrast of the authority figures in their various realms and halls of power with John, who is largely unknown and located far from the powerful in the wilderness. God's word passes by all these powerful individuals, all these important people, and comes to John, who eats locusts and wild honey in the desert. But mostly, Luke is making the theological claim that God comes to us in history, in the world, and in the context of our lives and global events. So often we, as mainline liberal Protestants, tend to spiritualize our discussion of God's coming into the world, turning it into an elaborate metaphor of an inward experience. After all, how many times have you heard the sentiment in some form or another that Advent is about preparing for the birth of Christ in our hearts? But Luke's words fight against this tendency to spiritualize. God's word came to us through the mouth of John, who was in the wilderness when these particular people were in power and in this time in history. A couple weeks ago, Matt and I purchased our first Christmas tree since moving to Vancouver. It's not our first Christmas here, of course, but for various reasons, including travel to see family, we just hadn't gotten around to fully decorating for the holidays. But this year, we're staying here, and now we are in an apartment with enough room for a tree, and the time seemed right. The arrival of the tree also meant that we opened the box of ornaments that made the move with us, but which we had not opened nor laid eyes upon since Christmas 2019, when we still lived in Connecticut. As we set about preparing our tree and home for Christmas, there was this surreal feel to it, holding ornaments and reflecting on all that had changed since we last held them. A global pandemic, saying goodbye to congregations and friends, moving across the continent and to a new country, finding new communities, new friends, starting a new chapter in our lives here in Vancouver. But that wasn't the only reason it was surreal. It was also surreal because of the realities of our world today. There we were in our apartment, a bright moment of holiday cheer as we carried out our ritual of Christmas preparation, while this new country that we call home faces political uncertainty as Trudeau grasps to power and the winds of political change gather strength. While just south of the border, we are just months away from Donald Trump ascending to the presidency and unleashing his particular brand of chaos upon the United States and the world. Across the ocean, President Zelensky enters the 3rd year of war as his country continues its fight to drive out Russia from the land. And Putin continues his reign of isolation and conflict, and Netanyahu leads Israel in a time of great violence and bloodshed. As we set about preparing our homes for the holidays, as we've been preparing our church for this season, as we all prepare for family gatherings and social events, I find myself asking, how are we preparing for God's arrival? Because if we take nothing else from Luke's words this morning, let it be this. This is how, this is where, this is when God's word comes among us. In this context of change, of political uncertainty, of war, of tense truces, God's word comes to us. How are we preparing? Because we can be sure John the Baptist was preparing. Luke does not leave us to wonder what John's preparatory work meant. Couched in the language of creation itself, Luke describes the preparations for God's salvation as making the pathways straight, of filling valleys and leveling hills and mountains, and making the rough places plain and smooth. To our modern ear, this might be distressing, especially in a world where strip mines have filled valleys and cut the tops off mountains. But that's not what is meant here. If you've ever gone on a hike or a long-distance bike trip, then you know the effort involved in traversing every hill and mountain in your muscles and bones, and you have felt the slowness of rough terrain impeding your progress. Because for Luke, the prophet's work is to remove the barriers that stand between God's people and God. Next week, we'll hear the rest of this passage and specifically how John goes about tackling those barriers. But for now, it has me wondering about the barriers that exist in this particular time, this particular place, this particular context where God is coming to us again. What are the barriers in our community, our neighborhood, our city that come between us and encountering God's word? Because there are barriers. Some of them are physical, literal, actual mountains and rough places, or in our context here, lots and lots of stairs and locked doors. After all, our building cannot be entered without a working pair of legs. Now, we've taken steps to remove or at least lessen those barriers, from simply keeping the doors unlocked so that all may enter, to installing an elevator so that our many steps do not prove to be mountains for those with limited mobility. But there are other, even greater barriers. There are barriers around issues of poverty, class, prejudice. And I don't necessarily mean here, but in the church at large, that leave people feeling unwanted and unworthy. And there are barriers around a lack of knowledge and familiarity with religion in our increasingly secularized world. And there are even barriers for those who have perhaps experienced too much religion and have been hurt and wounded by people of faith. Yes, the barriers are real. And sometimes we are the barrier that stands between God and God's people. The barriers are real, and yet people still hunger for God. They still seek out the divine. John was not standing around in the wilderness by himself saying, gee, let's get rid of these barriers. John was in the wilderness surrounded by the crowds who hungered and longed for God. John was in the wilderness surrounded by those seeking God, saying, we must prepare for God's coming by tearing down all that tries to separate God from God's people. As we said about our holiday traditions, preparing with decorations for family, special meals, church services, we must ask ourselves, how are we preparing for God's arrival? Because we do not exist in this world alone. We are surrounded by people of all walks of life who are seeking God. And I see that same hunger for the good news, for a connection with the divine, even in our secularized world. I see it written on the faces and hearts of the people who walk through these doors all week long. And I see it in the people I encounter on our neighborhood sidewalks and streets. Everywhere I look, I see a longing for something more, a desire to connect with something greater, the divine mystery that stirs in the hearts of all people. And Advent comes. It comes again year after year as a reminder that people are seeking God, and God seeks to be found. And we must prepare the way here and now.